Now we do this mathematically with a simple model. I hope you can bear with me for a few moments. Basically what we're looking at is you have a normally distributed asset. Each period we have two large investors. One of them is hit by a liquidity shock, which means that the person has to say buy or sell the security, right? In this case, he needs to buy the security. And the assumption is that the other large investor can absorb the shock at zero cost to him or herself. So they just have the shares that they can sell the other side, not a problem. We assume that there's also a continuum of small investors, making an assumption about the size of this continuum. Meaning that it's sufficiently large, in fact, to absorb the shock of the investors. And we trade, there's a certain trading probability with which these entities, these small investors would be willing to participate in the market. So in particular, what that boils down to is that in each period, mass one wants to buy, mass one wants to sell of them. So what that really means is so very abstract, is that when you enter the market and forget about the large trader, the small traders could come together, and on average they always even out, and they could trade with one another, and that's it. Okay. So in other words, there's no need for an intermediary. If you had an efficient system, everybody could be happy. And we're looking at a world where you repeat trading, and the traders that are large are long-lived, so they actually remember what's going on. All right, now this model, by the way, has no asymmetric information of any kind, so it's not applicable to all securities, but it's particularly applicable to just having normal trading. Okay, so now when the liquidity trader is hit with a shock, then the trader has the choice between several different systems, right? So number one is they can go to a peer-to-peer system, and they can interact with people directly, right? So these could be large traders or small traders. Now, ideally, they would like to find the large trader, right? Because that would be the easiest way to get their trade done. The alternative for them is they can go to a market maker. Now, this market maker is risk averse and basically charges a price which is linear in the quantity that somebody demands. Okay, so it's completely straightforward. There's nothing difficult about this. All that they basically say, for each unit that depending on the size of the unit, that depends the price that you have to pay. This market maker will have an inventory of some form, and that kind of shifts the public price around, but this is not really what we're after. Now the problem is that every time you trade with this intermediary, there's an inefficient transfer of risk, because the intermediary is risk averse, right? And ideally what you want to have is that the small traders trade with one another, because their demands even out, so there's no intermediary needed, and the large traders trade with one another. But whenever the large traders don't trade with one another, it has to go through the intermediary, and the intermediary wants that risk, and therefore this is an inefficient risk transfer. Okay. The way we assume this is whenever the peer-to-peer trades are not successful, the residual is just then traded with the intermediary. And there could be small traders or large traders that trade with the intermediary. So, and then what we're asking then as a question is, how much is traded with the intermediary? The more is traded with the intermediary, the worse is this for general welfare, for everybody involved. Now, there's two costs that are associated when you want to trade the security. Right? So the first one is that we assume that there's some data processing costs. So if you want to go through the peer-to-peer system, we assume that it's costly, right? Because you have to find the other side, and that potentially takes time, let's say, and that is a cost for you. It takes you some form of effort. We also assume that there is some form of validation cost. So every time you make a transaction in the peer-to-peer system, you have to make a payment. This is usually what you have to pay to the blockchain miners. Then there's also an indirect cost, and that is the possibility that there could be something called front running. Now, this is different from the front running that you have from decentralized exchanges, although not entirely, but this is kind of a little bit unrelated to it. And so the idea is simply that if the liquidity trader approaches the liquidity provider and says, "Hey, I want to trade X," the liquidity provider or potential liquidity provider could turn around, trade in the open market, and then turn around to the liquidity trader and offer the shares at a different price. And so essentially what this liquidity provider could therefore do is try to extract rents from the liquidity trader. That's essentially what we have. Now, we're looking at 3 different forms. So this is the basic model ingredients, and basically what we're trying to look for is the equilibrium based on these particular parameters, and depending on some other model parameters that I have not talked about. So we're looking at 3 settings for understanding of ownership. Number 1 is there is full transparency. So think about this as the benchmark case. There's common knowledge of who is the large trader. You can see all the ideas. You can identify who is what. And you can therefore assume, and you have also a single ID only, because because you can see what is there. Even if you're a big trader or a liquidity provider, you would, somebody would be able to tell and piece together all of your holdings across multiple IDs if you had them. And since when you want to trade, you would always have to pay, whenever you move from one ID to another ID, you have to pay a fee. It's most efficient to put everything in one ID. Okay. So then the second setting that we're looking at is one where there's no transparency, but we allow only a single ID. So there is a peer-to-peer network, but in this peer-to-peer network, people are just randomly matched, and it's very difficult to find who the big guy is. And then finally is a system where there is no transparency, where the ownership, however, cannot be inferred. So in other words, there's a continuum of IDs that you can see, and in particular, the large traders have spread their holdings across the continuum ID, and they do this specifically because they want to obfuscate ownership. And let's assume that that's what people want to do.